Well, thanks for coming, everyone. When I was getting this talk together, I thought, well, I could just launch into explaining 55 maps of the GAB, or I could sort of give a bit of background of why the GAB is important and the history and the work that has gone on over the last century. So like I say, I'll give you a brief introduction. This is the outline of my talk. I'll give a timeline of discovery, so from the early exploration in the late 1800s, then I'll jump towards the more recent work in the last 30 or 40 years, the Commonwealth involvement in the Great Artesian Basin. Then I'll give a brief overview of some of the work in the map atlas, the Hydrogeological atlas, and then I'll look at our current knowledge gaps. And I've put some nice pictures in so people can sort of feel warm and look at people wearing shorts up in northern Queensland. So this is, I guess, this is a typical artesian, well, not a typical artesian bore, but an interesting one where we get water flowing at the surface, and this is more recently we have this capping and piping of these bores and distribution methods. So the GAB, so it's big. I guess we all know that. 1.7 million square kilometres, 20% of Australia, covering parts of Northern Territory, South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland, from effectively Dubbo in New South Wales all the way up to Cape York. So elevation, we've got sort of quite high areas of the intake beds on the eastern boundary of the basin, so you can get up to 600 metres in some of these areas up north of Hughenden here, and then we have the lows of Lake Eyre here with 15 metres below sea level. So like I said, Stuart pointed out, it's the largest groundwater basin in Australia, and it's a vital resource for the pastoral industry in the arid parts of central Australia, supporting agriculture, the resource sectors, and is the water supply for many towns in the basin. So volume of water, it's hard to get your head around this figure, but close enough to 65,000 million megalitres of water within the basin. But I guess when you look at that figure, you think, well, that's a massive amount, potentially inexhaustible supply, but the important resource in the basin is the pressure and the ability to have water flowing at the surface without the need for pumps. 3,000. Currently there's roughly about 3,000 flowing artesian bores in the basin. So for those of you who don't know, artesian bores, the water will flow freely at the surface. It has a pressure head, the tensiometric surface or water level is above the ground, and you get this upwelling of water and free flowing of water at the surface. But in addition to these 3,000 artesian bores, there's 30,000 sub-artesian bores across the basin. So effectively the thing's pretty much like a pin cushion and it's peppered with bores all over the place. So the GAB, well, it consists of a number of sub-basins, geological basins that make up the GAB. We've sort of been tinkering with the definition of the GAB through the GAB water resources, but our current position is the GAB comprises the Eromanga, Carpentaria, Surat, and a little bit of the Clarence-Morton Basin down here in the east. It comprises 5 regional aquifers that extend across much of the basin and 4 regional aquitards. In the centre of the Eromanga Basin, we get this sequence can be up to 3 kilometres thick, and basically the age of deposition is Jurassic Cretaceous, between 200 and 65 million years ago. Okay, history of understanding. Well, you know, we like to think it was discovered by the European settlers, but the Aboriginals knew about the Artesian Basin as far as 30,000 years ago due to the presence of springs across the basin. So there's some archaeological evidence potentially around Carnarvon Gorge of occupation around these springs of 20,000 years ago. So it's not a new thing for the Indigenous population. This is probably a picture we won't see. This is out in South Australia. This is one of the mound springs in South Australia. So quite iconic picture with these date palms, sort of remind you of an oasis, but I think these have all been removed now. They were considered weeds, so they don't exist anymore. but it was a good picture at the time. So if you look at the distribution of springs across the basin, so there's these light blue areas there, sort of supergroups within the basin, groupings of springs. There's 13 of these supergroups across the basin. If we go down to individual vents, South Australia alone has around about 5,000 vents, spring vents. So I said that the Aboriginals knew about the springs way before the Europeans did, but it wasn't until the 1800s that the early explorers started exploring the centre of Australia. So we had Edward Eyre, Benjamin Babbage, Warburton and John Stewart, who noted these springs on their expeditions. Stewart, whose expedition went from Port Augusta up to Darwin, called some of the area in South Australian spring country north of Maree, and questioned where did the water come from these springs. So this is a famous quote from him: "Whence do they derive their supply of water?" If we see his route, basically he went from Port Augusta in the south, followed the springs up past Maree towards Alice Springs. So soon after the discovery of these springs as a permanent water supply, the first overland telegraph between Port Augusta and Darwin followed this line of springs through South Australia. So this is Strangway's telegraph station, the abandoned ruins of the telegraph station, and down here you can see one of these GAB springs giving water supply throughout the year. Not long after, I guess, the telegraph would put through, but in 1878 the Garn Railway loosely followed the line of the telegraph up to Maree, and the railhead at Maree was the station head, or the area where the Afghan camel drivers supplied the properties to the north of Maree. So this is a typical mound spring along in South Australia. This is called the Big Bubbler, and there's an extinct mound spring in the background there. So yeah, so the early explorers had discovered these springs, but then it piqued interest in others. Where did the water come from to supply these springs? So 1878, T. Rawlinson did a paper to the Philosophical Society of Adelaide, speculating about underground water in the interior of Australia, and he was confident that water could be found, and decent supplies could be found. So all this early work in the 1880s suggested that you could get this artesian water within the basin, but really it was Robert Jack, the Queensland government geologist, who first really pushed the idea of and speculated on the existence of artesian water. He also put forward the idea there was this large synclinal trough in Queensland that had pervious beds containing artesian water. So I'll jump forward to the first bores that were drilled. There were a couple drilled in New South Wales around Berg, I think. These didn't really spark much interest. They were just shallow ones drilled next to existing springs. But if I go back, so Robert Jack really got onto the Queensland government hydraulic engineer John Henderson to have a go at drilling a bore and looking for artesian water in 1885 around Blackhall. Unfortunately, this was a bit of a dud. They had all sorts of problems drilling this hole, and it was aborted in 1888. But the year after, a private pastoral company paid for a bore to be drilled near Cullamale. So Thurlagoona number 1. So this was the classic artesian bore where it, once they hit water, it blasted the surface and they had huge flows. And that really piqued the interest and sparked the artesian age within the basin. So soon after, in Queensland we had 505 bores by 1899. So it was like a bit of a gold rush for water. So, and it's, likewise in New South Wales, 364 bores by 1910. So this map here shows the distribution of these flowing artesian bores across the basin. Huge concentration around Cunnamulla where those first bores were drilled, but all the way up to Cape York and across to South Australia. A lot of these South Australian bores obviously follow that line of springs or nearby. So with this rush to access artesian water, there was a real push to understand and manage the resource from quite early on. So interestingly, Jack continued his work looking at the basin and had commenced mapping the intake beds of the basin as far back as 1894. So we like to think some of this is recent work, but it was done very early on. So basically by the early 19th century we had a good idea of the extent and shape of the basin, and it was accepted as a classic artesian basin. But there was this perception that there was this inexhaustible supply. But soon after all these bores were put in, there was people became alarmed at the rapid diminishing pressures and flows in some of these bores. So that instigated a number of interstate conferences, I think 5 in total from 1912 to 28, that were really looking at the causes of these pressure declines, the origin of the water, and how water flowed within the basin. And around this period too, it was legislation and licensing was introduced to conserve the resource, so it wasn't this just free for all accessing water in the basin. This is a bit of a map from Rin Habmal's hydrogeology map in 1997. So this shows the decline in pressures in some areas from 1880 to 1970. So it's a bit hard to see, but around here we're up to sort of 80 or 100 metres decline in head. So I'll jump forward and we'll look at the bore discharge. Again, like I said, of the 4,700 bores that were originally drilled that were artesian, about 3,000 remain artesian at present. This number's actually increasing, and I'll get to that. But around 1915, there wasn't that many bores, but discharge, there was a massive amount of discharge, like 3,000 megalitres a day. Presently, there's about 1,500. And much of this is due to changes in water distribution used for the basin. So this top picture, this is historically how water was distributed across properties. We had these flowing artesian bores just running into bore drains all day, every day, and distributing the water to the stock across a property. Obviously, only a small percentage of that water was ever used by stock, so much of this water was lost to evaporation. Also, it was a conduit for weeds and feral animals throughout much of these areas. So this is the much less exciting look of bores within the GAB now. So this is a controlled capped and pipe bore, distributions via pipes to tanks or troughs, much more efficient way, easier way to manage the country. You can turn taps on and off and move your stock around, not stuck with these large bore drains. So jump forward again to 1999, before there was a real emphasis on capping and piping these bores. There was 34,000 kilometres of bore drains. So I've been to some of these properties and these bore drains can go on for 10, 20 kilometres. It's mind-boggling in some ways. So around this period, 89, there was the first attempt at controlling some of these, stop the wastage. So there was a Commonwealth, state and privately funded program to rehabilitate a lot of these bores, get rid of the bore drains and put in these piping works. Some of these bores, this is probably an example of a good bore with an outlet into a bore drain. Some bores were so badly degraded that in the middle of a big pool there could have been a bore casing, which is hard to cap and pipe. Some of this capping and piping involved building little causeways out to the bore and shutting it in and rehabilitating. So savings in 2010 were estimated about 173 gigalitres a year. Okay, I'm going to I've given you a bit of background. I'm going to jump forward to the conceptualisation of the basin, people's understanding of how water moved and the processes in place. So, like I said, early 20th century, we sort of had this it was a classic artesian basin concept. So it was a simple layer cake model, lateral flow from intake beds along the boundary of the basin, obviously on the eastern side, and also a little bit on the western side in South Australia, and water infiltration from rainfall moving down these aquifers to the southwest and discharging at springs in South Australia. So it wasn't till probably the early 70s that the BMR at the time decided to get involved with understanding the Great Artesian Basin again. So interestingly, back as far as 1971, that was the first attempt to numerically model water flow within the basin. So there was a French consortium that came across and worked in BMR for a few years, and they did a lot of work collating information across the basin and came up with this idea that the system must be dominated by vertical leakage rather than horizontal flow, which contrasts to this model here. This was basically when they looked at the patterns in the water table, the shallow aquifers, versus the deeper artesian potentiometric surfaces. So then we moved on. It was a sort of fairly unsuccessful attempt at modelling back at that time, and there was, I think, the French consortium left early. They didn't quite complete their work. So it wasn't until 1980 that Rin Habermal did some work. He actually sort of brought together the thinking across the whole basin. There'd been work done within individual states, but this paper that he brought together did in 1980, really, he actually changed his conceptualisation of how water was flowing, went back to this layer cake lateral flow model with possible upward leakage along major structures and faults. And again in 1997, this conceptualisation persisted. He brought a map of the hydrogeology of the basin, again looking at basically conceptualising as lateral flow from the intake beds on the eastern boundary, moving down to the southwest. This map sort of refined the boundary of the basin, gave it a slightly updated potentiometric surface from what he'd produced in 1980, and provided a regional cross-section showing these massive regional aquifers and aquitards. So it wasn't until 2000 that there was a lot of hydrochemical information that had been collected, that another go was attempted at looking at understanding the processes within the basin. So Bruce Radke and others in 2000 looked at the implied hydrodynamics based on the hydrochemistry, but this was for just one aquifer, the main artesian aquifer, the Cadnan-Hurray aquifer. And that work came up with this concept of preferential flow paths, and deep stagnant areas. So it makes some sense. You get quite tight sequences at depth, the fairly stagnant groundwater, very little flow here in the Arumanga Basin, a little bit in the Surat. I'll just point out here, we had, at the time there was no data, very little data in the Surat Basin at all, so it was actually chunked out and wasn't considered, which is interesting. So, in light of the amount of data we got from coal seam gas and at the current day. So we have these preferential flow paths down these shallow areas, Yellow Ridge as well, and large stagnant areas. So a bit more complex conceptualisation, plus the concept of upward leakage. And then back, step forward another 13 years. We seem to be going in decades really. So Gabra had a look at, it was a desktop study funded by the Department of Environment, and they were keen on getting all existing information, publicly available information. There was no new data collection for this exercise, and having a look to see whether the existing conceptualisations could be updated again. So as more data came to light, it just seems to be getting more and more complex. So again, it's a complex system, not surprisingly, with a large component of vertical throw through fractures and faulting. So We had Habermas sort of alluded to it in 1980, but it became more and more apparent this is a major component of groundwater flow within the basin. Some of the other work that came out of Gabra looked at the hydrostratigraphy, so revised some of the work that had been done by Habermas, identifying the major aquifers and aquitades, and came up with a more gradational classification from aquifer to partial aquifer to aquitade or leaky aquitade. In addition, Gabra really sort of focused in on looking at connection with other basins, so lateral connection with other geological basins and underlying and overlying basins. So this is a bit of a conceptual understanding of what might be these vertical conduits within the basin and how lateral flow might work. I'm not going to go into this, but this is a concept that Bruce Radke has put forward about the presence of polygonal faulting in the major regional aquitade, the rolling downs group, and how these structures within this might actually be conduits to upward leakage. Okay, so that's your introduction to the history of the basin. So the main title of the talk was about the atlas, so I'm going to talk about the atlas now. This was a bit of a thought bubble at the start. We thought it would be useful to get collate a lot of the information that we'd gathered through working on Gabra, some of the ideas we didn't get to actually move forward as part of Gabra, and putting it into one fairly easily to read document. So basically we came up with this document some of the key geological and hydrogeological aspects of the basin, the hydrochemistry. It's not comprehensive, there are things we could have included, but we just wanted to pretty much document what we'd been doing recently. And of course this wasn't a small undertaking, it seemed like an easy thing at the time, but we had a number of authors, a huge amount of effort doing the cartography for this thing, so Adrian de Helen did a lot of work, a lot of iterations on making these maps look how we wanted, and Dan Rawson did a good job in sort of making the presentation look really good in the end. And I'll point out this wasn't just a groundwater branch project, it was a collaborative project between Andrew Feitz and the Resources Division, who did a lot of the hydrochemical work and had collected a lot of the data in the Surat Basin as part of his carbon capture and storage project, and went through and QAQC'd all the existing hydrochemistry data, which was quite a time-consuming job. So, what's the atlas got in it? So, it's basically, we've split it into three sections. So, the first section is just really documents some of the key hydrogeological and geological aspects. So, it looks at a slightly revised hydrostratigraphic table, documents some of the major structures across the basin, and some geomorphology, but I'll get to that in a minute. The next section is pretty much, even though a lot of work had been done across the basin for the last 100 years, I still had people asking me, can you give me the boundary of a particular aquifer? All I could give them was something done in 1997 fairly quickly for a numerical model. So we thought we really need to go back and actually pin down the subsurface extents of some of these major aquifers and aquitades. So Bruce Radke went and laboriously went through all the logs, worked out the extents and thicknesses of all these major hydrostratigraphic units. And finally, like I said, there's a whole section looking at the hydrochemistry, the spatial variation and chemistry from multiple aquifers across the basin. Right, so when we did some work in Gabra, we actually slightly tweaked the definition of the Great Artesian Basin. So Habermas 1980, 1997 included portions of underlying older geological basins, specifically part of the Galilee, the Bowen Basin. We took the view that we would constrain this just to the Jurassic Cretaceous sequence and look at these connections as connections to other basins. I guess there was a consistency thing here, like it was the top sequence of the Bowen and Galilee, the Triassic sequences that were included, which was inconsistent with what was happening in South Australia. as far as the Cooper Basin goes. Yeah, so that's what we're stuck with the atlas, this more restricted views. So with that, we've defined a new boundary. As we've got new data and interpretations, we've refined this boundary, and we now know it's not a discrete, isolated system. There are these lateral connections above, below, and above and below. So if we look at this picture here, the purple areas are the parts of the Bowen and the Galilee that we've excised that we don't include, that were included in the Habmale maps. This is some better definition of the extent of the GAB based on some AEM work done down here in the Macquarie Marshes area, and this is some more recent mapping done by South Australia. Okay, so this is the regional hydrostratigraphy, which is a bit hard to take in 20 seconds, but basically what we've got is a correlation of all the lithostratigraphic units across the basin based on their geological basins. So we have the precipice sandstone, which is mainly in the Surat Basin, but the main artesian aquifer, is the Hooray sandstone, which extends from, includes the Pilliga sandstone in New South Wales and extends across most of the basin. So like I mentioned before, we've persisted with this more gradational approach for classifying the hydrostratigraphy between aquifer and partial aquifer, leaky aquitard and tight aquitard, because when we look at these hydrostratigraphic units at a local scale, some of these regional definitions actually don't stand up very well. And this was apparent with all the new information that we've been receiving from work in the Surat due to the coal seam gas industry. So one of the revisions we made was originally we had Hutton sandstone in the Surat as a major aquifer, which made sense when you looked at some of the outcrop north of Roma. It looks like a good candidate to be classified as an aquifer, good clean sandstone. But then we got some more information from some of the drill core that the coal seam gas companies have been providing, and the Hutton sandstone looked a bit finer and more interbedded with finer grained sediments that we'd like to think would an aquifer would be. So we downgraded in the Surat anyway the Hutton sandstone to a partial aquifer. Other areas, obviously, the regional hydrostratigraphic classifications hold up pretty well. So this is the Gilbert River Formation, which is an equivalent to the main the Cadnam Hooray, which is the main artesian aquifer, most widely utilised aquifer within the basin. So you get these massive sandstones that on the face of it look like, why wouldn't they be a good aquifer? This is Porcupine Gorge just north of Hewenden, and this is the precipice sandstone, that base aquifer of the Gab in the Surat Basin and Carnarvon Gorge. Recently, talking to the coal seam gas guys in the Surat, they consider this to probably be the best aquifer in the Surat. So. Right, sorry for that little sidetrack, but back to what's in the atlas. So we've updated the hydrogeology map of the basin. So we have revised outcrop and subcrop extents of the 5 major aquifers and the 4 aquitards. Another sort of move away from the definition used by Habmale, we've actually included the Paleogene Neogene sequence as part of the GAB. Previously, other workers have just stripped it off and didn't consider it, but there's potentially, if upward leakage is a major component, there's interaction between some of these Cenozoic basins and the GAB. Okay. Aquifer and aquitard thickness. So basically we've got, like I say, the five major aquifers are mapped out. We know that we've looked at the thicknesses. It's a little bit hard to see, but these are the data points that we used. Some areas it's a bit sparse. We've stuck to just the lithostratigraphic logs to derive these. We've purposely not used interpretations of seismic. So we can see from this picture, this is the Cadney-Hooray aquifer, so the most widely utilised aquifer across the GAB and most extensive. So we can get depths of up to 700 metres over here in Pulluena Trough, and also over here in the Mimosa Syncline, 700 metres. These actually coincide with major basement depocentres, or structures, sorry. Throughout the atlas, to allow people to understand where they are in the sequence, we've provided this stratigraphic table and actually highlighted what lithostratigraphic units make up this aquifer. So you can flick through the aquifer and know exactly where you are in the sequence and look at the constituent units. Like I said before, we did some work identifying the potential connection between basins below the GAB, so along this dotted line here. This is really just a regional first pass, looking at the juxtaposition of similar aquifers or sandstones on sandstones and trying to identify where you could possibly have connection. So if you look in here, basically the hatching and the clear areas, if you can imagine the base of the GAB, so where we don't have any patterning, that is a sandstone. As the hatching sort of increases in intensity, you're getting finer grade sediment. So what you're looking for, and basically the colours represent what the rock types are in the basement underneath the GAB. So deeper blue means a good sandstone, potentially a good hydraulic connection. So what we're looking for, these non-striped areas with a blue colour, areas where you could potentially have good hydraulic connection. Another example in the first section is we've done a geomorphology map of the entire GAB. Jim Kellett and Bruce Radke spent a lot of time enjoying themselves, getting out the 1 to 250,000 geological map sheets and looking at the DM and developing this map. So it's quite detailed. We've got quite detailed classification across all of the basin. We've had another go at looking at the regional groundwater flow directions for the main artesian aquifer, similar to what we showed you with the HABMAL maps and the 1997 potentiometric service maps, based on new data between 2000 and 2010. One of the issues with trying to do this type of thing is, monitoring across the basin now is getting more and more, there's less and less monitoring going across the basin, so you can't get a good feel for a particular year. You have to look at a period of 10 years to get enough information to derive this type of map. And again, it's a regional interpretation that we know at a local scale could differ. So if we look at this map, we've got three major regional flow systems. So you've got a northern flowing system, northern and westerly flowing system up here in the Carpentaria Basin. You have the eastern system away from the recharge area, so you've got the outcropping extents of the Cadney-Hooray formation here. It's a little bit hard to see, but along here, and movement away down dip away from these elevated areas on the east. You also have this smaller westerly flow system. There's been a lot of work done around about 2013 by the South Australians looking at recharge in this area, and a lot of this can be associated with episodic recharge through the Fink River, pumping water into the at the base of the Fink River. This water gets pumped into the aquifer and inducing this type of flow direction. Okay, so we did this. Well, this is work we did for Gabra, but we've included this in the atlas. Jim Kellett went through and mapped the water table. Now this was a huge task. I think it took him about 8 months to do. Hand contoured. Again, it's a composite water table, whatever information you can find. But the reason why we did this, we wanted to look at the patterns within the water table and see whether there's any indication of upward leakage or what's going on at the surface that might let us understand what's happening deeper down. So basically, if you look at the water table, it occurs in the intake beds on the east there. passes into the Winton-Macunda Formation, the Gryman Creek as you go into the basin, but also includes water table in the Lake Eyre and the Currumbin Basins in Carpentaria. So a few interesting things come out of that. So if you look at the two major rivers within the Eromanga Basin, the Diamantina and Cooper Creek, they actually look like they're actually draining the water table, so there's some interaction there. So too, if you look at, this is the a basement ridge across here, the Eula and the Bowen Ridge, and it's a little bit hard to see, but potentially it looks a bit like there's a bit of a groundwater divide between the Surat and Eromanga Basin based on this water table surface. There's a couple of areas where it can punch through. There we go. So, variations in groundwater chemistry. So, why are we interested? Well, basically this gives us an insight into how groundwater flow processes that are influencing groundwater movement across the basin. We plot it up spatially, we can see some patterns and sort of make some interpretations. So what we had was TDS, alkalinity, pH, major ions and some isotopes that we'd plotted up spatially. And we did this for the Rolling Downs group, which is the aquitard that sits above the main artesian aquifer, the Cadenary Hooray aquifer, Dorey Springbok and the Hutton Sandstone equivalents, and the bottom aquifer, the Precipice Sandstone and its equivalents. So, like I say, Radke 2000, they only considered the one formation, but we had some additional information now where we can look at the patterns between these aquifers and look for relationships. So if we're going to look at, this is an example of one of these maps. So this is again the Cadenary Hooray aquifer. We did some carbon-13, plotted up the carbon-13 isotope concentrations. And if we look at, focus here on the Surat, where we didn't have data in 2000, but now we do. Interestingly, we can see some patterns here that sort of make sense. So, whoops. So the Cadenary Hooray, or the equivalents, the Muga, Gubramunda and Rallo in the Surat Basin, sit above the main coal seam gas bearing sequence, the Walloon coal measures. So we can look at this odd concentration or enrichment of carbon-13 here and have a think about how that could come about. So I guess carbon-13 is an excellent trace for carbonate evolution, and you can also get this enriched signature where you get bacterial reduction of carbonate to methane. Previously in the Surat Basin, these elevated or enrichment areas of enrichment were attributed to marine carbonate dissolution, but when we compare these spatial maps with some of the other isotope maps, we can pretty much be confident that it is this carbonate reduction signature is the main process going on. And okay, so we go to the aquifer below the Walloon coal measures, and again we'll focus on this area over here, the Hutton Sandstone. Once we plotted it up, we came up with some quite odd looking patterns. If we look at the salinity, what we'd expect to see is sort of quite low salinity in the intake beds, increasing down flow paths like we see in the Eromanga Basin. But if we focus in on the Surat, it's different. The conceptualisation and how recharge is working there doesn't fit with what we're seeing. So we're getting these quite high saline areas in the intake beds. So our conceptual understanding of just infiltration along the elevated areas along the east here and flow to the northwest don't seem to be bared out by this information. And more recently, speaking again to the guys doing work in the coal seam gas in the Surat, they seem to think that recharge in the Hutton Sandstone is much, much less than we previously thought. Back in 2003 we did some work, we didn't have much information here, but we basically chloride mass balance pretty much in simple terms. If fresh water means high recharge and high salinity is probably low recharge. So, but we calculated recharge of 2 to 4 millimetres a year in this area back then. Current thinking is that this is orders of magnitude less than that, so potentially groundwater extraction from the Hutton sandstone and the Surat is almost mining it. Okay, so that's just some examples of some maps, but in the background of background work as we were doing this atlas, a major component was the data management and getting the data ready to be released. So I guess from the start we saw the atlas as a showcase of the work and data holdings that we have. Plus it was effectively an index of the data. So from the start of the project, we considered the life cycle of the data. So, like I said, all data we produced was intended to be released. So the data management component of this project probably took up 10 to 15% of our time. It included, QA, QC of the data sets, providing detailed metadata for every data set we released. And as it turned out, we probably had a document equivalent size to the atlas, so 100 pages of metadata, just referencing the source data and the methods used, so not an insignificant component of the project. And I guess I'll point out that if we tried to do this at the end of the project, I don't think we could have released the data in a timely fashion, and it would have been a nightmare. So, okay. So what we've got, we can access the data. So the atlas is available on the GA website, downloadable as a PDF. It's got a little web page here with Andrew Feitz telling us all about the exciting parts of the atlas and what's wonderful. So you can view that. But in the back of the PDF, we actually list all the data sets that we've used. We give the name and a number that can be used to download these data sets. So if you feel inspired, download the PDF and knock yourself out with all the playing with the data sets. So what's the next steps? Well, we're looking at adding to the atlas, putting some additional maps. We know we didn't cover everything we could have, and it was a conscious thing at the time. So we're looking at including the spring locations, land use, mining, petroleum, gas tenants. We're sort of working on that at the moment. In addition, we think it'd be useful. It's nice to have a paper copy map, but they're quite expensive to print. Not as easy to distribute, but making looking at these Esri story map type presentation where you can have text and not quite an interactive map, but you can zoom in and out and look at the information and photos or whatever you like. So we're looking at doing that, plus providing all the data rather than downloading individual data sets, providing a web service to get at that data. So in summary, this is just for the atlas. So it provides insights to the current understanding of regional geometry and physical characteristics of the gap. But again, I'll emphasise it's a regional perspective, which we could use to underpin local scale investigations. And it's a valuable resource for water managers, communities, to support informed water management decisions. We've had quite a bit of interest from Queensland, who are developing their water resource plan for the Gab at the moment. They were keen to get copies so they could have that on hand when they're developing those plans. We've also provided some data to the COSAP project. This is a bit of a side. I've moved on for that. So about a month ago, we did a workshop looking at research priorities. So even since we've done the atlas, more information has come out of the Surat Basin, and we're starting to rethink about our conceptualisations and moving these things forwards. So we decided we'd have a look at organising a workshop. So these are some of the key research priorities that came out of that workshop. So one of the fundamental questions about the GAB is how much water is going in and how much is going out. The water balance. You'd like to think we had a good idea of what it was, but in reality we don't. So questions come up: how would we do a reasonable water balance in the basin, and what's the appropriate scale? Is doing a water balance at the GAB wide scale feasible, or should we be focusing on smaller areas? Like I touched on with the Hutton example there, our recharge estimation and conceptualisation is probably a bit dated now. This is reinforced by some work we did in doing for the bioregional assessments in the Galilee Basin. So previously our recharge estimates pretty much negated the impacts of the overlying Cenozoic cover. It appears that up in the Galilee at least, there's some impermeable layers in the cover that are impacting recharge into the GAB. It's looking like less and less recharge. Again, connectivity above, below and within the GAB. It's a key question. We still don't. We think it's happening. We haven't quantified it. The influence of tectonics and structure within the basin. So we alluded to the fact there might be this polygonal faulting. We still don't know whether these are conduits or barriers. We probably need to do some further work on that. Springs, obviously an important aspect of the basin. Some of these springs are EPBC listed, have some endangered species, quite unique. But in some areas we still don't really have a good idea of what's the source aquifer. So any developers nearby, we need to know where those springs are deriving their water. More work on the hydrochemistry. Basically we've done a lot of work in the atlas, but there's a lot more interpretation we could do to look at that interaction between the different layers. And what's the effect of climate change and variability? Are we basically just looking at paleo recharge? Is that what we're using in the GAB? Is anything that's happening in the intake beds now having any real impact on water resource in the GAB? Probably not. So the ultimate question, is our current level of understanding adequate to manage the resource? Well, no, is my opinion. So there you go. That's it. Thanks for listening.